1839, Alabama. The sun rose red that morning, as if it already knew the weight of the day. Daniel was 19, born on the soil he was forced to till, tall but wiry from hunger. His back carried more scars than years. They called him boy, though his eyes had already hardened into a man's. His master, Mr. Thompson, found peculiar amusement in him, not for his labor, but for his humiliation. Guests came often. The parlor filled with whiskey laughter, the smell of tobacco, the rustle of silk gowns. When the hour grew late, they demanded a different spectacle. Daniel was dragged in, stripped to the waist, ordered to dance while they clapped off-beat and shouted for more. His ribs were sharp under his skin, sweat clung to him in the candlelight, and every movement he made fed their laughter. They laughed not because the dance was comic, but because his body was theirs to command, his dignity theirs to crush. Sometimes the overseer whipped him while wagers were placed on how long he could stand. Sometimes wine was poured over his head like baptism into mockery. Once they tied him to a wagon and drove the horses through the yard until he collapsed, dirt choking his mouth, while the white women applauded as if it were theater. He had been forced to crawl back to the quarters that night, crawling past torches and shadows until his knees were raw. The scars healed poorly, but it was not the lashes that lingered. It was the laughter. The way they looked at him as though he were less than flesh, less than breath, a creature born to amuse their cruelty. That was the wound that never closed. At night, he returned to the cabins, where 10 bodies pressed into one foul space, where bread was divided into crumbs and swamp water passed for drink. Rats gnawed at children's toes, while mothers hummed to keep them still. The walls sweated in the summer, froze in the winter, and the air always stank of damp straw, sickness, and despair. When one child coughed too long, the others closed their eyes and prayed it would stop. Death in the quarters came like a thief who no one tried to resist. If anyone spoke too loud of hunger, too openly of despair, by morning they were gone, disappeared without trace. Their clothes would be hung on the fence as a silent sermon, a shirt flapping in the breeze, a bonnet nailed to wood. No explanation was given, no grave was dug. The plantation lived on in silence because silence was survival. Daniel learned quickly. He did not raise his voice. He did not protest. He bowed when told to bow, worked when told to work. But in the silence of his compliance, he stored something sharper than anger. He carried patience like a blade hidden under cloth. There were nights when he lay awake, his body trembling from exhaustion, and he let the images return. Thompson's red face shining with drink, the overseer's whip curling in the air, the white women clapping with jeweled hands as his chest bled. The memory burned, but he did not let it consume him. Instead, he turned it cold, pressing it deeper inside until it hardened into something unbreakable. The world around him offered no justice. The law spoke only for his master. The preacher who came once a month told them their chains were God's order, that obedience would earn heaven's mercy. Daniel had stopped listening. He watched the preacher ride away on a fine horse, belly full from the master's table, while the slaves returned to the cabins with nothing. Hypocrisy walked freely, while truth was left in the mud. Yet Daniel did not despair. He understood what others did not. Despair was exactly what they wanted. To despair was to give them victory before the fight began. He chose something else. He chose silence, but not as submission. Silence as a mask, patience as a weapon, and so the humiliation continued. Dawn brought labor in the fields, mud sking at his feet, cane knives biting his palms raw. Dusk brought the same old rituals of mockery whenever Thompson wished to parade his power. Daniel endured, but endurance was no longer passive. With each command obeyed, with each whip survived, with each laugh swallowed, he sharpened himself. The cabins whispered of rebellion sometimes, but fear smothered it before the thought could grow. Daniel did not speak of rebellion. He did not need to. He carried it wordlessly, like a seed under ash. His eyes gave nothing away, yet inside he was planting something that no whip could scourge away. One evening, as the sun fell crimson behind the pine trees, Daniel was again summoned to the big house. The guests were drunk, voices heavy with mockery. "Dance," Thompson ordered, slapping the whip against his boot. Daniel obeyed, moving like a shadow across the floorboards, his bare back striped and gleaming with sweat. The guests roared. One demanded he bark like a dog. Another tossed coins at his feet. Daniel fell to his knees. The sound of coins clattering on wood echoed like chains being dragged. He lowered his head, not from obedience, but because it hid his eyes. Behind the mask of submission, his gaze burned with something the masters could not see. That night, when he returned to the cabins, he did not sleep. He lay in the darkness, listening to the shallow breathing of children, the quiet sobs of women, the groans of men broken by years of labor. He looked at the shadows that bent across the walls and imagined them as weapon sickles, chains, fire. He imagined the master's laughter choked into silence, and for the first time he smiled. Not outwardly, his lips never moved, but inside he smiled at the thought of patience ripening into fire. Every year when the fields turned gold and the barns swelled with grain, Thompson's plantation staged its harvest feast. To the whites it was tradition, a celebration of abundance, a night to toast wealth carved from the backs of the enslaved. To the slaves it was spectacle and mockery, a night when their tormentors gorged themselves while forcing the people in chains to sing hymns and dance like entertainers. For Daniel, 19 years scarred and silent, the feast was always the worst of nights. The big house blazed with lanterns, music from fiddles spilled through open windows, and laughter shook the wooden beams. Slaves were lined up like livestock, ordered to clap, to sing, to shuffle in rhythm. Every year, Daniel stood among them, jaw clenched, eyes lowered. That year, 1839, the humiliation reached its peak. Thompson, drunk on whiskey, called Daniel forward. "Kneel," he said, his voice heavy with the arrogance of ownership. Daniel dropped to his knees. "Now bark, boy, bark like the dog you are." The crowd erupted in laughter. White men slapped each other's shoulders, white women hid their smirks behind silk fans. Daniel stayed still, his knees pressed into dirt, head bowed so they could not see his eyes. Inside something crystallized. That moment, amid their roars of mockery, he made a vow. The feast that had humiliated him would one day be remembered not for laughter, but for ruin. From that night forward, Daniel lived with two faces. To his master, he remained the obedient slave, silent, enduring, always present when summoned. To his fellow slaves, he was another body bent in the fields, another voice swallowed in hymns. But in secret, he began to prepare. He worked in the barns by day, sorting grain, cleaning tools, hauling bundles of hay. It was dull work, the kind overseers ignored. And in that neglect, Daniel found his freedom. The barn became his hidden ground, its corners storing more than harvest. He began to collect, broken chains discarded by the blacksmith, stones heavy enough to crush bone, wooden handles that could be sharpened into spikes. Each object hidden beneath straw, stacked behind barrels, concealed like seeds waiting for spring. At first he worked alone. But silence draws silence, and pain recognizes its reflection. His closest ally became Isaac, a man whose body was massive and whose silence was deeper than his own. Isaac had lost everything his wife sold to Mississippi, his children dragged screaming into wagons bound for Louisiana. After that, Isaac had spoken no more than 5 words in as many years. He moved like a shadow, did what was ordered, and never looked men in the eye. But when Daniel revealed the first stash of tools, Isaac's gaze met his, and in that gaze was understanding. Others joined quietly, women who had lost children, men who bore fresh welts. Even those too weary to hope placed something in the barn, a sickle, a cane knife, a rusted file sharpened into a blade. They carried their weapons as they carried their grief hidden but never gone. To the overseers, the slaves looked the same, bent, exhausted, submissive. But in secret, they sharpened steel and spirits alike. Daniel's leadership grew not from words, he spoke rarely, but from his stillness. He carried himself with a quiet gravity that others began to trust. He never promised freedom. He never spoke of victory. He only worked, patient, deliberate, turning silence into preparation. At night, in the cabins, whispers spread, not wild dreams of escape, not fragile hopes of the North, but whispers of reckoning. Daniel listened to them all, never confirming, never denying. His strength lay in patience, in letting hatred grow slowly, like roots underground, unseen until they split stone. The nights of humiliation continued. Thompson continued to summon him, continued to mock, continued to force him into dances and barks. Each act of cruelty only deepened Daniel's resolve. The laughter of the masters no longer pierced him, it only fed the fire inside. He endured because endurance sharpened the blade. One evening, Isaac came to him, his face lit by firelight in the barn. "When?" he asked, voice gravel from years of silence. Daniel looked at him, eyes dark and calm. "When the fire burns bright enough." Isaac nodded. That was all. No speeches, no grand plans, only patience. And so the year turned. The fields bent heavy with cane, the barns filled once more. The white men drank harder, boasting of profits, singing hymns of harvest. The women prepared gowns for the feast, while slaves scrubbed floors until their hands bled. In the barn, hidden beneath straw and tools, the arsenal waited. Sickle blades polished against stone, chains coiled like serpents, stones stacked like offerings. Every object carried weight, not just in iron, but in memory of whips, of sails, of laughter that turned men into animals. Daniel's heart did not pound faster. He did not grow reckless. He did not rush. He was as patient as the soil itself. He knew the feast was coming, as it always did. He knew the laughter would rise again. And when it did, so would the fire. For years they had forced him to kneel. For years they had called him dog, toy, shadow. For years he had bowed his head. But in the quiet corners of the barn, amid the dust and grain, something else had been growing. Not submission, but a seed. A seed of hatred, a seed watered by humiliation, fed by silence, rooted in patience. A seed that would one day split into fire and blood. And Daniel, once their entertainment, now carried it like a torch hidden under straw. The night of the harvest feast came heavy with smoke and music. The air itself seemed swollen with arrogance, as if the very soil resented the weight of laughter spilling from the big house. Lanterns hung in trees, casting pale gold light across the yard. Wagons of guests arrived, their wheels crunching gravel, their riders drunk before they dismounted. Women's gowns swished like river water, men's voices thundered with toasts before a single cup was raised. Inside the big house, long tables groaned beneath roasted meats, corn puddings, candied fruits, whiskey and wine. Silverware clattered, glass chimed, candles burned high. The overseers, flushed with drink, strutted about as if they too were masters, barking orders at the slaves who moved silently through the hall. Every dish served, every cup poured, was a reminder of their bondage. Outside, beneath the autumn sky, the slaves were ordered to sing. Their voices rose in forced hymns, ragged, trembling, held together by fear. Each note fell into the night like a chain striking stone. Daniel stood among them, singing because silence would mean a lash. But his eyes were elsewhere, on the barn. That barn was packed with the season's wealth, grain stacked high, hay piled dry, wood beams rubbed smooth from years of harvest. It was abundance, but also vulnerability. Daniel had prepared for this moment all year. He knew the dry timbers were thirsting for flame. He knew the straw would catch faster than breath. As the night grew louder, the guests drunker, and the overseers more careless, Daniel felt the stillness inside him sharpen. It was time. He looked once toward Isaac, who stood nearby, silent as ever, his massive hands curled at his sides. Isaac met his gaze. No words. Only a nod. Then Isaac slipped away toward the barn, his steps hidden beneath the clamor of fiddles and drunken laughter. Inside the barn, the shadows were thick. Isaac's hand held a torch, flame trembling against the dark. Daniel joined him, and together they pressed the fire into the dry straw. The hay erupted instantly, flame racing upward, licking the beams, roaring into the rafters. In seconds, the barn was alive with fire, sparks shooting into the night sky like furious stars. The alarm came late. The whites were too drunk, too sure of their safety. At first they laughed, mistaking the blaze for spectacle, some holiday fire set for entertainment. But the fire was no jest. The heat swelled, the crackling roared, the barn timbers groaned and split. Then panic. Fire! Someone shouted, voice shrill over the fiddles. Glass shattered, chairs toppled, boots scraped across the floor. The feast erupted into chaos. Women screamed, clutching skirts. Men stumbled, sloshing whiskey as they ran for the doors. But the exits, the pathways they expected, were already blocked. Slaves stood there, waiting, not with bowed heads or folded hands, but with chains coiled like whips, sickles gleaming in the firelight, stones gripped in fists. Their silence had ended. Their patience had ripened. The first overseer who lunged for the doorway fell instantly, skull crushed by a stone. Another staggered, shouting orders until Isaac's chain whipped across his throat, silencing him forever. The guests tried to push past, but every door, every gate was ringed with those they had mocked for years. The fire spread mercilessly, swallowing the barn, spitting embers into the night. Smoke rolled across the yard, choking breath, stinging eyes. Screams rose, mixing with the roar of flames, blending into one terrible hymn. Daniel moved among them, no longer silent boy, no longer entertainer. He carried a sickle, its blade honed against stone, and with each step he cut down the laughter that had haunted him. He struck without frenzy, without waste, every movement precise, every blow a memory answered. The whites who once strutted proudly now crawled through dirt, begging, choking, clawing at the ground as if the earth itself might save them. But the earth had never been theirs. It had always belonged to the sweat and blood of the enslaved. Tonight it bore witness. Some tried to pray, some tried to bargain, some clutched at their jewels and fine coats as if wealth could shield them from fire. But fire has no master. Fire takes all. The feast dissolved into madness. Chairs overturned, wine spilled into mud, silk gowns caught sparks and burned where their wearers fell. The long tables that had once groaned under food now lay broken, scattered with plates smeared in grease and blood. And through it all, Daniel stood tall, his face lit by the inferno. The boy who had been forced to bark like a dog now watched his masters crawl on all fours, choking and blind. The youth who had danced for their amusement now moved with deadly grace, every step a rejection of humiliation. The fire roared higher, consuming the barn until its roof collapsed with a thunderous crash. Sparks showered the yard, igniting the grass, catching at the hems of coats, searing hair and skin. The whites screamed louder, but there was no one left to hear them with pity. Slaves who had once been shadows were now fire themselves, unrelenting, consuming, unstoppable. They swung sickles, hurled stones, pulled down men who had thought themselves gods. The night of harvest had become a night of reckoning. By the time the flames began to wane, the yard was littered with bodies. Some lay still, sprawled across the mud. Others twitched, gasping, their fine clothes blackened with soot. The smell of burning grain, burning wood, burning flesh filled the air, thick and unforgettable. The music had stopped. The laughter was gone. In its place was only fire's hymn, and the sound of vengeance answered. Daniel's hands were blistered from the torch, his arms streaked with soot. But his back was straight, his eyes unblinking. Around him, the others stood in silence, their weapons dripping with sweat and smoke. They did not shout, they did not cheer. This was not joy. This was memory made flesh, humiliation turned to fire. For years, they had been forced to dance for their master's amusement. Tonight, the dance belonged to them, and its steps were carved into history with flame. Morning did not arrive so much as creep. The night's smoke thinned into a bitter fog that clung to the yard and made even the crows keep quiet. What the lanterns had gilded hours before now lay in ruin, tables cracked, silver half sunk in mud, bottles turned to black glass, the barn a charred skeleton pointing at the pale sky like a curse. The masters' bodies were where terror had dropped them at gates, beneath windows, near the well. No fiddles, no orders, only the whisper of cooling embers and the low, living breath of the fields. The enslaved gathered without command, drawn by the silence that follows thunder. They did not cheer. They did not speak of victory. They only looked. Smoke had rimmed their eyes in soot. Ash salted their hair. Some still held tools darkened at the edges, as if the iron itself had learned memory. A child cried once and was hushed with a palm and a hymn that trembled. In that first light, they were not a chorus of triumph, but a congregation of witnesses. Daniel stood apart, palms blistered raw, the torch's bite seared into his skin. Pain moved through him like a slow tide, but his back did not bow. The boy they had dressed in insult now stood like a post they could not pull from the ground. He looked over the wreck barn ribs, scattered finery, the long smear of a man's last crawl, and felt no joy, only balance. The laughter that had carved his scars had at last been given back to the mouths that made it. Balance is not peace, but it is a kind of breathing. Isaac came beside him, soot masking the road of tears that had dried on his cheeks. He did not ask what came next. He knew. They all did. The feast's music would travel faster than the fire. By noon the riders would come. Neighbors, patrols, men with badges, men without mercy. The law would arrive, wearing the same face as the lash. Daniel spoke quietly, the way one speaks to a skittish horse. "We scatter," he said. "Take the woods, the creek beds, the briar, pairs only, never the road." Heads nodded, no one asked where to meet. In bondage they had learned, places are taken, memory is the only map that cannot be stolen. Some prayed. Not for forgiveness, for swiftness. A woman named Mercy tied rags around a boy's soles so he would leave no prints on the sand road. Two brothers pulled a hidden bundle from beneath the cabin's salt pork, a file, a book of hymns without its cover. Old Lila, who could no longer run, pressed a charm into Daniel's hand. A button wrapped in twine and hair. "For crossings," she said. He closed his fist around it and felt the small pulse of an old world. Before they moved, the dead were counted. Not the masters, the enslaved who had fallen in the smoke and press. Thomas from the Cane gang, who had stepped between a blade and a girl. June, barely 12, trampled when the guests stampeded. They were laid together under the pecan, faces turned east. Someone spoke their names. The wind took the syllables and threaded them through the scorched rafters. What the newspaper would later call chaos, the yard called a service. Then the riders came far off at first, like flies at the rim of a cup. Hooves, the jingle of a bit, the crack of a voice already hungry for punishment. Daniel gestured. The yard broke apart like a school of fish under a hawk's shadow. Into the cane, into the pine, into the water's brown mirror. Feet remembered the paths they had traced 100 midnights, the soft places where a body leaves no story. Isaac paused only long enough to grip Daniel's forearm, a strength pressed from one bone into another. "If they take me," Isaac said, "make sure the children know my wife's name." Daniel answered with a nod that meant, "I already do." He did not run first. He walked the edge of the yard, the way a farmer checks for sparks after a burn. He looked at the porch where he had danced and saw the boards blistered into waves. He looked at the wagon traces where they had dragged him and saw only hoofprints turning toward fear. He turned his gaze to the fence, the one that had once carried the clothes of the disappeared, and found it bare. The wind moved through the empty rails and made a sound like a throat clearing before a testimony. By the time he took the woods, the patrol was at the gate. Men shouted questions with answers already printed in their mouths. Devilry, insurrection, outside agitators. They found no speeches, no letters, no maps. They found only ruin they could not command. They made a story anyway, because stories are how power keeps its hands clean. The first rider to dismount kicked a blackened beam and said, "Savages," as if the fire had not been taught its hunger by his kind. News galloped. By sundown, plantations 2 counties over had ordered their cooks watched, their stable doors chained, their hymn-singing cut short. A notice tacked in town called the night a madness. Another called it a warning from God to tighten discipline. None named the thing the yard knew, that patience can bloom into flame, and that silence is not consent, but kindling. In the dark, Daniel and a small band moved along the creek where cypress knees rose like knuckles from the water. They travelled by the taste of the air and the way frogs fall silent when a man steps wrong. Once a lantern swung far behind them, then vanished. Twice they heard dogs. Twice they sank to their chins in the black water and let reeds write halos around their heads. The charm in Daniel's fist stayed warm. The names in his mouth stayed warmer. They found an old maroon camp, half ruined, hidden where the creek's bend traded water for shadow. There, under a ragged lean-to, they lay with their backs against roots and listened to the forest pronounce them alive. No one slept. The night does not grant rest to those who have torn a page from the book of fear. It grants witness. Isaac whispered at last, "This ain't freedom." Daniel answered, "No, it's memory with breath in it." By the week's end, some were taken. That was the world's order, same as drought and flood. The patrol dragged men in cords through town, showed them like trophies, spoke verdicts before judges had time to knock dust from their sleeves. Whips answered what fire had asked. Gallows grew from courthouse lawns like winter trees. Newspapers printed comfort for buyers, order restored. But in the cabins, in the fields, in the hush between call and response, another report was kept. A boy who had been made to bark stood up, and the laughing stopped. Daniel did not return to Thompson's land. He moved like weather here with timber crews, there with canal diggers, always near water, always near trees. Sometimes, at dusk, he taught a child how to step where the ground forgets you. Sometimes he left a stone sharpened to an edge beneath a church step, where a woman would find it and understand. He avoided the places where men with pens built new fences of law, and he stayed close to the paths where memory travels fastest. He learned to live with what had been done. The night's faces visited him, the living, the dead, the wide eyes of a woman who had lifted her skirts from sparks, and then, seeing him, lowered them as if to bow. The fire did not leave his hands, it slept in his scars and woke when he closed his eyes. He fed it only this, the vow that he would never again dance for laughter. The vow that if ever called boy by the old mouth of power, he would answer to a different name, one spoken in quarters like a secret and in swamps like a prayer. Years later, riders still told the story wrong, but the right version traveled barefoot. Mothers whispered it into the soft crowns of their children. Field hands bent to drink and let it cool their tongues. A hymn in one county gained a new verse in another, and the chorus changed shape until it sounded like fire cracking in green wood. They did not all know Daniel's face. They did not need to. It was enough to know that on a harvest night in Alabama, patience wore the mask of silence, then took it off and showed its teeth. It was not freedom. It was the gate opening inside the mind. And once that gate opens, no rider, no whip, no law written in any clean hand can close it for long. The barn had taught them that. So had the laughter, now gone quiet as ash. Some evenings, when the wind turned east and the frogs tuned themselves to the dark, a man passing a fence might stop and see a shirt pinned there by a single nail. No blood, no name, only cloth moving like breath. He would touch the fabric and feel, beneath his palm, the thrum of a story that refused to die. Then he would walk on, shoulders a little straighter, eyes a little harder, carrying the rumor that had ripened into legend. That humiliation can be turned into fire, and that a slave can learn to make patience into a blade. And Alabama, which had once believed itself immune to memory, learned to bow